Welcome to the deep dive. Our mission is pretty simple. We take a stack of your sources,
Yeah.
everything from practical guides, historical accounts, right through to scientific observations,
hmm
and we pull out the most important, surprising, and, well, thought-provoking insights. It's your shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
Absolutely. And this particular set of sources is fantastic, actually,
Mm-hmm.
because it lets us connect ideas you might not normally see together.
Right.
You get this really holistic perspective on quite a range of topics.
Exactly. Today's deep dive is particularly rich, I think. We're going from practical advice for today's challenges
Yeah.
to ancient predictions that are just mind-boggling, then into these really personal journeys of faith and even looking at, microscopic wonders in nature.
Quite the mix.
It is. Okay, let's dive in. So let's begin with something I think is incredibly relatable for many of us, protecting ourselves from crime. Our sources kick off with a rather stark reality check. They say in many places, it's not if you'll become a victim, but when. That really highlights how dangerous just being complacent can be, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. And what's striking, I find, is how the source material immediately pivots from that sobering thought to practical preventative steps.
Right.
It actually quotes a Bible principle. The wise see danger ahead and avoid it, but fools keep going and get into trouble. It really emphasizes that avoiding the situation entirely is often your best protection.
And the consequences, they point out it's not just about physical harm or losing stuff.
No.
Our sources really stress the lasting mental and emotional damage. There's the story of Corinne,
Oh, yeah, I remember that one.
who screamed when she was attacked. It's such a powerful example of how a simple, immediate reaction can be surprisingly effective. She actually said, "I've learned that it works."
Yeah, simple but effective. So this deep dive breaks down protection into four main types of crime. First up, robbery.
Okay.
That's theft, using force or, threats. The advice is pretty straightforward but crucial. Be really aware. Thieves look for easy targets, so don't dull your senses with alcohol or drugs.
Makes sense.
Protect your property, secure your car, your home, keep valuables hidden, don't flaunt them. The source notes, wisdom is with the modest ones. And if you're traveling, definitely seek advice from locals who know the area.
Good tip. What's next?
Second is sexual assault. Now, this isn't just rape. It covers any sexual contact involving threats or intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
And the message here is absolutely clear. The victim is never responsible.
Crucial point.
Absolutely. Key advice includes trusting your gut feelings. If a place or person makes you feel uncomfortable or uneasy, leave. Just get out.
All right.
The source also stresses acting confidently and reacting fast, screaming, running, fighting back, using the element of surprise. These are all highlighted as effective.
Okay, so physical threats. What about online?
Good segue. Third is cybercrime. This is all your online fraud, scams, things like that. The big warning from the sources is be wary. Professional-looking websites can be totally fake, and legitimate banks or financial institutions, they'll almost never email you asking for confidential info.
Right. Never click those links.
Exactly. The advice is, always check out a company's reputation. Look carefully at their policies. Do they have a physical address? What about hidden costs, delivery, returns?
All the small print.
Yeah. And be super suspicious of offers that seem too good to be true, especially promises of big money for little work or huge returns on low-risk investments.
The classic scams.
Pretty much. The source even cites the U.S. Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, which advises that higher promised returns nearly always mean higher risk. No free lunch, basically.
Okay. And the fourth.
And finally, number 4 is identity theft. That's when someone illegally gets your personal info and uses it for fraud.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It can be. It can lead to huge debts, a ruined financial reputation for years. One victim actually described it as even worse than having money taken.
Wow.
So the source emphasizes protecting sensitive info, changing passwords, often shredding documents. And crucially, keep a really close eye on your accounts. Check your credit reports regularly because, as it says, early detection can make a big difference.
Right. So if we pull all that together, the big insight seems to be proactive vigilance, right? Not just relying on locks and alarms, but cultivating this internal awareness.
Exactly. It's about where true safety really starts.
Which kind of leads us from these external threats to something maybe more internal or at least closer to home.
Yeah.
Disciplining teenagers.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
A challenge many face.
And the source material frames it really interestingly not as punishment, but as teaching.
Yeah, that's a key distinction. It highlights that common issue, teens breaking rules, like curfews or phone bans.
Mm-hmm.
And the source digs into why, pointing often to unclear boundaries,
Yeah.
where teens test the limits, especially if parents aren't consistent.
Right. If there's wiggle room, they'll find it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
But it also cautions against being too rigid, just endless rules that actually make things worse. The analogy used is really vivid.
With a butter one,
Trying to spread cold butter on soft bread.
it just tears the bread apart.
That perfectly captures that friction, doesn't it? Damaging the relationship. Exactly. So the source then gives these clear, actionable steps for, well, effective discipline. First, be clear. State exactly what you expect and what the consequences are.
Spell it out.
Right. It even suggests maybe writing down house rules and looking them over. Sometimes, are there too many? Are they still relevant?
Good idea. Then.
Then, be consistent. Avoid confusing your teen. The same behavior should lead to a similar consequence, and making the consequence fit the crime, so to speak.
Like an earlier curfew for breaking curfew.
Precisely. That scene is key. Next, be reasonable. As they earn trust, grant more freedom, talk with them, maybe even let them have some say in the consequences. That actually increases buy-in.
Interesting. Letting them participate.
Yeah. And finally, the ultimate aim, build character. Help them develop a healthy conscience
How do you do that?
by helping them think about the kind of person they want to be. Asking questions like, what traits do I want to be known for?
Focusing on the internal compass.
Exactly. It really emphasizes that long-term goal.
Yeah.
Helping young people make good decisions because they have an internal sense of right and wrong, not just because they're scared of getting caught or following rules blindly.
That's a powerful idea, moving from just rules to like genuine character development. Makes you think about the lasting impact of our approach.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of lasting impacts, our sources now take a huge leap back in time, millennia actually,
Right.
to an ancient story that feels almost like a movie. Cyrus the Great and the Fall of Babylon.
Oh, it's a dramatic one.
Oh.
The source is pinpointed to October 5th or 6th, 539 BCE,
Yeah.
Babylon, this city everyone thought was impregnable. Massive walls, the Euphrates River running through it as a
It
defense.
seemed unbeatable.
Totally. But Cyrus's strategy, according to these accounts, was, well, ingenious. He had his engineers divert the river upstream.
Divert the river. How?
They dug channels, presumably,
Yeah.
caused the water level inside the city to drop dramatically.
Yeah.
Enough for his soldiers to just wade in.
No way. Through the riverbed.
Yep. And apparently through river gates that were just left open.
Left open. Why?
Well, the Greek historians Herodotus and Xenophon add this incredible detail. The Babylonians felt so secure, so complacent, that many, including the king himself, were having a huge feast that very night.
While the enemy was literally walking in? That's unbelievable.
It is. And of course, this is the historical backdrop for that famous phrase, the handwriting is on the wall.
Ah, right. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so King Belshazzar was in the middle of this feast with 1,000 of his grandees, the source says, and suddenly this hand appears out of nowhere and starts writing on the palace wall.
Just a hand. Creepy.
Very. It wrote the words Mene, Mani, Tekel, and Parsin. Nobody could figure it out until they called in the prophet Daniel.
And what did Daniel say?
He interpreted it for the king. Mene. God had numbered the days of his kingdom and finished it. Tekel. He'd been weighed in the balances and found lacking. Parsin. His kingdom was divided and given to the Medes and the Persians.
Wow. Talk about bad news at a party.
Right. And according to the source, every single word came true that very night. Babylon fell. And ever since, the handwriting is on the wall has meant, disaster is imminent.
It's genuinely striking how specific that is, but the sources go even further with prophecies about Cyrus himself, right? What makes those stand out?
Well, what's really remarkable, according to these sources, is the level of detail and the timing. We're talking about prophecies recorded in the book of Isaiah, around 200 years before Babylon fell, maybe 150 years before Cyrus was even born.
200 years. Seriously, what did they predict?
They foretold that a ruler specifically named Cyrus would conquer Babylon.
Named him.
Named him, and that he would free the captive Jews. They also predicted that the Euphrates River would dry up. Metaphorically speaking, its defenses would fail.
Like the water level dropping.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that the city gates, those crucial gates, would be left open. And even that Babylon's soldiers would basically give up. They would cease to fight. The source stresses that all this happened.
That's uncanny. And the timeline for the Jews.
Also incredibly precise, as presented here. Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple razed in 607 BCE, and the Jews taken into exile in Babylon.
Okay.
God, the source says, foretold through prophets like Jeremiah that this exile would last 70 years.
70 years, exactly.
That was the prediction. Now, Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BCE. Soon after, he issued a decree allowing the Jews to return home.
Right.
The first group started arriving back in Jerusalem and Judah in 537 BCE, which is
Exactly 70 years after 607 BCE.
precisely in Babylon itself. As prophesied, the source notes, it eventually fell into ruin, becoming desolate wastes.
Wow. So connecting this back, the source then asks a pretty big question, doesn't it?
It does. It basically asks, how could mere humans possibly have known all this in advance, such specific details, centuries ahead of time?
And its conclusion.
Its conclusion is quite direct. It quotes the Bible saying, prophecy was at no time brought by man's will, but men spoke from God.
That's a profound claim that prophecy isn't human guesswork. So according to these sources, what does that imply about the nature of God himself? That's our next area.
Right. Well, according to the Bible, as interpreted by this source, God is described fundamentally as a spirit.
Meaning
Invisible to us, incorruptible, totally beyond our physical senses. The text states clearly, at no time has anyone beheld God. It even emphasizes we can't really even imagine what he looks like. Isaiah 40.1a asks, to whom can you people liken God?
So if humans can't see God, who can, according to this view?
The source says intelligent spirit creatures can. Angels, for instance, who live in heaven, always behold the face of my Father who is in heaven.
Okay, so angels see God, but this raises that common question, is God, everywhere at once, omnipresent?
Yeah, that's a frequent question. But the Bible, as understood here, doesn't actually teach that. Instead, God is presented as a person, a distinct individual.
A person, not just a force.
A person, yes. Described as a father who has a specific location, heaven, his established place of dwelling. The source points out that Christ, after his resurrection, ascended into heaven itself, now to appear before the person of God.
Okay, so God is a person dwelling in heaven. What's the key takeaway from that perspective for us?
Well, the source highlights a couple of things. First, because God is presented as a person, we can actually learn about him, develop a relationship, draw close to him.
Right, not just an abstract concept.
Exactly. And second, this view protects, it argues, against worshiping idols or images, lifeless things, because God is a living spirit person.
And what about that phrase, humans being made in God's image, if it's not physical?
Good question. It's not about physical looks, according to this interpretation. It means we're created with the potential to reflect God's personality traits.
Like what?
Like love, justice, wisdom, mercy. We're also made as free moral agents we can choose. We have creativity, we can appreciate beauty, and we have this inherent spiritual capacity.
A spiritual capacity.
Yeah, like a natural desire deep down to learn about our Creator, to connect with something beyond the physical. The source suggests that the more we learn about God and try to imitate his qualities, the more joy and real satisfaction we find in life.
Okay, that's a lot to think about regarding the divine nature. Now, let's transition from these more abstract concepts to a very personal story.
Right.
A journey of faith. We hear from Raquel Hall, who was raised Jewish but ended up re-examining her beliefs.
Yeah, her story, as told in the interview, is quite compelling. She had a very traditional Jewish upbringing, went to yeshivas, which are Jewish schools, kept all the customs. Her mother had even specifically warned her never to read the New Testament. Raquel was totally convinced her religion, Judaism, was the original one.
So what changed? What was the turning point?
It happened when she was 17. A Christian acquaintance challenged her quite directly, asked if she'd ever actually read the New Testament.
Ooh, confrontational.
A bit. He basically called her out for having a strong opinion on something she admitted she knew nothing about, called it ignorance. And apparently that really hit home.
I can imagine. So she decided to read it.
She did. And she was surprised to find the writers were all Jewish. She started seeing Jesus differently, as a kind, humble Jew.
But still not the Messiah.
Not yet. She still struggled with core Christian concepts, especially the Trinity. How could God die? She remembered the scripture, "You, God, do not die." That was a big stumbling block.
So how did she resolve that?
Well, she felt driven to find the truth. So she prayed, really sincerely, but for the first time without her traditional Jewish prayer book. Just spoke from the heart.
And then?
And right after that prayer, Jehovah's Witnesses knocked on her door.
Wow, talk about timing.
Right. So she started studying the Bible with them. Their discussions helped her understand Jesus, as she puts it, not as part of a Trinity, but as the Son of God and the beginning of the creation of God. a different perspective.
Okay, so that addressed the Trinity issue for her. But what finally convinced her about Jesus being the Messiah?
That's the fascinating part. It came down to the messianic prophecies in the Hebrew Scriptures, what Christians call the Old Testament.
She was skeptical at first, though.
Oh, yeah. She wondered, was Jesus really the one? Or maybe just a clever actor who knew the prophecies and tried to fulfill them?
A valid question.
Totally. But she concluded the prophecies were just too specific, too numerous, and some were impossible to orchestrate.
Like what? Can you give examples from the source?
Sure. For instance, the prophet Micah foretold, over 700 years in advance, that the Messiah would be born specifically in Bethlehem Ephrathah, in Judea.
Okay, birthplace predicted.
Right. Then Isaiah wrote that the Messiah would be despised, killed like a criminal, but then buried with the rich. Very specific, unusual circumstances. And his ancestry was key. He absolutely had to be a descendant of King David.
How could they prove that back then?
That's the crucial point the source highlights. Ancient Jews kept meticulous public genealogical records. So Jesus' contemporaries, even his enemies, could verify his lineage from David. They couldn't dispute it at the time.
Ah, okay.
But then, and this is critical for her reasoning, those records were destroyed. When the Roman armies devastated Jerusalem in 70 CE, those genealogical records were lost forever. So her conclusion, based on this source, was that the Messiah had to appear before 70 CE for his Davidic lineage to be officially publicly verified from those records. Anyone claiming it after 70 CE couldn't prove it in the same way.
That's a really specific historical argument.
It is. And for Raquel, these specific prophecies, combined with that historical cutoff point, were powerful evidence. She concluded Jesus of Nazareth must have been the prophet, like Moses foretold way back in Deuteronomy.
What a journey, rooted in text, history, and that personal search. Okay, so from ancient texts and deep faith, we pivot one last time to the world of natural design, specifically the amazing seeing skeleton of the brittle star.
Ah, this is fascinating. It's a reef-dwelling creature, related to starfish. And its armor, the hard plating on its upper surface, is incredible.
Why? What's special about it?
It's covered in these microscopic lenses, thousands of them. It basically turns its entire skeleton into one big compound eye.
Its skeleton is an eye. Seriously.
Effectively, yes. Scientists, the source explains, found these densely packed, crystal clear bumps, each thinner than a human hair. They're made of calcium carbonate calcite.
It's chalk, basically.
Well, a very refined form. And these aren't just bumps. They function as high-quality microlenses. They focus light precisely onto photosensitive nerve bundles just below the surface.
That's incredible engineering.
It really is. Chemist Joanna Eisenberg is quoted in the source saying it demonstrates an important principle. In biology, materials are often optimized for multiple functions. Here, armor is also vision.
Has this inspired any technology?
It has. Researchers have actually copied this natural design to create simple, really low-cost microlens arrays. Things like telecommunications, guiding light signals through optical fibers more efficiently, taking a cue directly from the brittle star.
Amazing. From a sea creature to fiber optics.
Exactly. Which, of course, brings us back to that fundamental question the sources often raise when looking at nature.
Right. Did this intricate seeing skeleton just, evolve gradually through random changes in selection? Or was it deliberately designed?
The classic question.
What a deep dive we've had. We've really covered some ground, haven't we? From safeguarding our homes and families.
Yeah, the practical stuff.
To uncovering these startling ancient prophecies and their historical claims. Then thinking about different views on the very nature of God.
Big concepts.
And finally, looking at the microscopic genius in a creature like the brittle star.
It really just shows the incredible breadth of insights you can pull out when you really dig into such a diverse set of source materials, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Each one offers just a completely different lens.
Absolutely. So, wrapping up, when you consider all these different threads, the claims about prophecy, naming a king, centuries before he lived, the detailed theological arguments about God's nature as a person, or the intricate functional design of something like the brittle star's eye skeleton, how might exploring these particular perspectives, these specific claims from our sources today, change how you view the world around you? Or maybe even how you approach different kinds of knowledge or evidence?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely something to mull over until our next deep dive.